Old Testament Basics, Lesson 9, the Wisdom Literature. In this lesson, we introduce the Old Testament's wisdom literature. When we refer to these books as the wisdom books, it's important to understand that the whole Old Testament and New Testament contain wisdom. From Genesis to Malachi and from Matthew to Revelation, the writers teach us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But the Old Testament books of Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes focus so much on wisdom that we actually call them the wisdom literature. The Old Testament sages had a very specific reality in mind when they talked about wisdom, and if we miss that reality, we lose much of their valued direction. The word translated as wisdom in the Bible is the Hebrew word chokmah. It was used throughout the Old Testament to talk about people who did things with skill. It describes the work of those people who embroidered the priest's garments back in the book of Exodus. These garments were to be beautiful because they reflected God's nature and his work. So God told Moses to select people who did embroidery with chakam. They embroidered with great skill. Other people who did embroidery would look at the priest's garments and say, "Now that's embroidery." I do embroidery, but not like that. That shows a skill level I can only wish for. Skilled carpenters and parents and leaders were said to do their work with chakam. In the book of Proverbs, we see that word wisdom over and over again. It is used to describe how people perform many of life's functions with skill. But when these proverbs refer to a person as wise, they describe someone who lives his or her whole life with chakam. Just as a person would look at the priest's robe and say, "Now that's how it ought to be done," so people who looked at a human life that was lived with wisdom would say, "That's how life should be lived." Because that person lives her life with chokmah. She's known as a wise person. Wise people learn to live skillfully because they live as God intended us to live. In the Old Testament, wise life required commitment to God's law. So when you read about wisdom in the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, they are referring to people who have skillfully applied God's teaching to their lives. That's why Proverbs 1:7 and 9:10 claim, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge." Only when we see God for who he is and live as he intended do we have any hope of living a wise life. The book of Proverbs is primarily a collection of wise sayings. Solomon wrote many of them, but there are collections of proverbs from other sages as well. That's why you'll see statements in the book of Proverbs that introduce others who wrote or collected some of these wise sayings. Regardless of who wrote or collected them, we believe they are words of authority because God inspired all of Scripture. We appreciate the sages' astute observations of life and their beautifully crafted proverbs, but we never forget that the wisdom they contain comes from a much wiser source. Proverbs 1:1-7 introduces the purpose of these collections of proverbs. Solomon used a series of infinitives to state the reasons why these proverbial statements were gathered together. The list includes to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction, to give prudence, to understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. This list includes two reasons for gathering these proverbs into a book. One is to provide a catalog of wise sayings to guide us in life. But secondly, the proverbs function like a mental gymnasium. The terms know, discern, receive, give prudence, and understand are action words.